On today's show, we're going to be talking with Phil Sletten. He's the research director at New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, and he, as part of his media gauntlet, has stopped in at Concord TV. Phil, thanks for stopping by.
Thanks for having me, Josh. It's great to be here.
Now, you guys send out so much great information that I hope all Granite Staters are aware of when it comes to the financial, well-being of our state. But could you just give us a summary, just real quick, the Fiscal Policy Institute and sort of the work that your organization does? And then maybe just real quick also, I think research director, is a self-explanatory title, but tell us a little bit about sort of your position and the work that goes into that.
Sure. So the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute is a nonprofit, independent, nonpartisan policy research organization. We're based right here in Concord. We examine the state budget, state revenue, the state economy, and the economic security of Granite Staters, particularly those of us with low and moderate incomes in New Hampshire. And the goal of that is to get good, high quality, reliable, and comprehensive public policy information, or information about public policy and the well-being of the state, how state government works, and the financial security of Granite Staters out into the public discussion, right? It's designed to, our goal is to get more information that people can rely upon for both understanding what's going on in the economy, understand what's going on with the state's finances and how the state structures its programs, its assistance to individuals, its services, and try to get that information to the hands of anyone who's interested, including policymakers, including community leaders, journalists, advocates, and really anyone who wants to learn about it. So as research director there, I oversee the research operations, and that includes, we're a crew of 7 people, and the research team is 3 people. So I help make sure that all of the research is happening in a timely manner and that we're getting to the topics that we need to get to that are relevant for public policy discussions in the state.
I love that you mentioned the reliability factor too, that you're an organization that you do the research and people know they can go to you for what are the numbers and reliable information, because we know in today's age there is so much information out there and not all of it is helpful, or not all of it is vetted professionally. So I think that's a really crucial component. And when we talk about the revenues, you mentioned state revenues, all the different sources that the state of New Hampshire collects revenues, whether it's through, I think real estate is one of the categories, and New Hampshire is a very unique state in terms of some of the revenue avenues that we have. You had issued a brief about long-term state revenues, and it seemed, I don't want to use the word gloomy, you could tell me what the more appropriate word would be. Give us just a recap of sort of the key findings of this report that I think just came out probably on Monday of this week, if I recall correctly.
Yes, so what we wanted to look at is, we try to look at state revenues every month, right? Every month the state collects a certain amount of revenue from its array of sources, which is a pretty diverse array of revenue sources, by the way. The state doesn't rely on 1 or 2 really large sources. It relies on an array of mid-sized to smaller sources, with 1 or 2 that are significant, but not half of our state revenue coming from a single tax revenue source, for example. So we wanted to take a look, not just our month-to-month usual snapshot, but looking at what do we know so far about state fiscal year 2025, which ended back in June. We have the preliminary numbers from that. How did that compare to prior years? How did that compare over the long term? And then doing things like adjusting for inflation to see how much can you actually buy in terms of services with the revenue that the state is collecting. So we tried to take a little bit of a longer view, and now we're several years out from the pandemic, so we know we're not just seeing the seesawing economic factors associated with how we saw some wild swings in corporate profits, for example, which is the driver of one of our largest tax revenue sources. Saw some pretty wild swings in the real estate market. Now things are at least nominally settling out from that. So how have revenues trended over the decade so far? And this gives us an early look at that.
So would you say there's been a couple of fiscal years that have been relatively back to normal in that sense of what you mentioned?
Yeah, at least some of the revenue sources are back to normal. It's hard to say the fiscal years are back to normal because it's hard to know exactly what normal is, in part because not only are the revenue sources changing because of underlying economic factors, but there have also been policy changes during this time period that have affected what state revenues look like as well. And that's both increasing revenues and decreasing revenues depending on the source that you're looking at. Yeah. So it's hard to set a complete baseline for here's what it would be if we didn't have a pandemic and we didn't have those policy changes. It's hard to say what is normal, but it's certainly a little bit more stable in the economic picture, although there's still plenty of changes going on, a little bit more stable in the economic picture than we saw in, for example, 2020, 2021, and 2022, when there were some really wild swings in economic activity because of the pandemic.
Right. Now, one of the concerning things that was in here, I believe, is the business revenues. There was a drop that you guys, in your report from this past fiscal year, a drop in the revenues collected through business taxes, and where does that come from, and what does that say? Is that a long-term trend, a one-off? What's the analysis of that?
Yeah, great questions. Yeah. So there are two primary business tax revenue sources the state has. And you could argue that many tax revenue sources are collected from businesses, right? The insurance premium taxes on insurance companies, sure. But there are two that are that affect many businesses in the state. Not all, but many. One is the business profits tax, which is sort of a typical state corporate income tax. It's based on after certain expenses and adjustments, what were your profits, and the state will tax a certain percentage of that, 7.5% to be precise. The other is the business enterprise tax, and that is based on compensation paid by businesses to employees, compensation, interest, and dividends paid or accrued for basically to fund their workers, right? Yep. And those two revenue sources are often measured together because they're usually filed together and paid, or at least paid together in their estimates. So when we're talking about business tax revenues, we're actually talking about two taxes, but the business profits tax is the primary one. And that can swing quite a bit because state corporate tax revenues are generally among the more volatile tax revenue sources. And our business profits tax in New Hampshire is the largest single state tax revenue source that the state has. Yep. So it's actually twice as large as the next largest one, which is the meals and rentals tax. Yep. So the changes that we've seen in profits, which went up dramatically following the COVID-19 pandemic. They dropped initially and then went up very substantially, more than 50% increase in national corporate profits. We saw that big swing in New Hampshire's business profits tax revenue at the same time because those corporate profits at the national level were picked up in New Hampshire's business profits tax revenues. Now, some of your viewers might be saying, well, you're talking about national corporate profits. What does that mean for New Hampshire? Like, how does that impact New Hampshire?
Right.
It's because businesses that operate in multiple states and in multiple countries still pay taxes here if they're also operating here, or more precisely, if they have a certain percentage of their sales here. Okay. And wherever their profits are made, the portion of their profits that are owed to New Hampshire based on economic activity in New Hampshire is based on sales in the state. Yep. So what that means is you could have a multi-state, multinational corporate entity, right? Many different corporations that are reporting together in a combined fashion. And wherever those profits are earned, the New Hampshire bases how much the tax base is, or what portion of those profits are owed to New Hampshire based on sales in the state as a percentage of their total sales. Okay. So those national corporate profit swings do matter. And we saw some pretty big swings up after the pandemic. Yep. We've seen that level out, and we've seen some policy changes, both in terms of how the tax is calculated and on the tax rate, that have likely led to substantially lower revenues since, say, roughly 2022 when revenues peaked.
Okay. Now, the other element that I thought was really fascinating, I mean, a lot of this is, but the housing prices are cited as another reason that we've seen fluctuations with revenue coming in. So how do house prices factor in, I guess, holistically, the concept of housing prices and the impact on revenue collected by the state of New Hampshire, and then what's driving that change?
Right. Yeah. So believe it or not, I'm actually not going to talk about property taxes here because local property taxes...
That's its own...
Right. Local property taxes are the majority of state and local tax revenue collected in New Hampshire, but at the state level, property taxes are actually relatively limited. There is a statewide education property tax, but that collects a fixed amount every year. So the property values don't affect affect those revenue streams at the state level
This
as
is
much.
like a transfer, real estate transfer. Is that what that is?
Yes. So the real estate transfer tax is the state's primary tax revenue source that is affected by those property values. And the real estate transfer tax is when you're buying or selling property, right? Or interest in a property. And it trends quite closely to the sales of single-family homes in New Hampshire. So it's based on two things. One, you have to have a transaction, right? There has to be a sale.
Right.
And the second is, what is the price of that sale? What is the value of that sale? And we saw following the pandemic, we saw sales increase and prices rapidly increase. But then as interest rates went up, sales dropped substantially. And that meant those real estate transfer tax revenues went up and then went back down. And they appear to have reached their low point and be maybe recovering a little bit. But both sale volume, even though prices are very high, sale volume is still quite low. And that means that that's collecting less revenue.
Oh, okay.
So that one appears to maybe have bottomed out and be climbing back up a little bit. Business tax revenues, we don't know if they've finished declining yet at this point. And that's a bigger factor when it comes to the state's finances.
So we'd be having another discussion at this time next year, analyzing this current fiscal year and seeing the next wave of impact.
Yes.
It's an ongoing game that we're playing here, that we're chasing the numbers and looking back at the previous fiscal year.
Yes, absolutely. And legislators, when they are putting together their state budget projections, which they did back in the spring, they have to take that snapshot in time and say, what's it going to look like? What is state revenue going to look like for the next 2 years? And that's where they have to do things like project, well, what are corporate profits going to be? How much are people going to be paid? What does real estate transfer tax revenue look like? Like how many homes will be bought and sold and for what price? How many people will go out to eat and pay meals and rentals tax?
Right.
All those things are factors that they have to consider when they are projecting revenues going forward.
Sure. And a couple other categories that I guess they're not lumped together, but in my head I just thought of both, which is lottery and also liquor commission. It looked like the lottery revenue had gone up, but liquor commission, it looked like over even the past couple fiscal years, a decline in the revenue generated by the liquor commission, which, as people know, is a state-run enterprise. Right. So they're two different things, but I'm just kind of lumping it together for the sake of this question. What are some explanations for those numbers going up and then also going down?
Yeah, and you're right to lump them together because neither one is a tax revenue source, right? They're revenues generated from profits that are essentially enterprises the state runs, right? So they're businesses that the state run, they generate profit, and those profits go to fund other things that the state government does. So lottery commission revenues have been going up both because some of the existing lottery games, like playing in the lottery, have been increasing in terms of the amount of revenue collected, but also because of expansions of lottery opportunities, right? Expansions of various forms of legalized gambling. So Keno is one. Sports betting is another. Mobile online lottery is another. We're about to have video lottery terminals legalized in New Hampshire as well. As of this most recent state budget, they're now going to be legal and operating. So those revenues have expanded because there are more ways for people to play, more ways for people to participate in lottery commission activities and generate profit. Liquor commission revenues have been going down, and the Liquor Commission has identified a couple factors for that. One is that people are drinking less, especially younger people are moderating the amount that they're drinking relative to prior generations. And this is actually a global phenomena, so this isn't just in New Hampshire. They also identify that there's more competition from some other ways that people can access alcohol, including through online retailers or retailers in other states that people might actually go to. Typically, people have come to New Hampshire to buy alcohol at our liquor stores in the state.
Right, they'll drive up from Mass. Or,
or on their way to Maine, they'll stop at the liquor store on the highway, right? But there is some additional competition from retailers, including ones that will ship liquor to people, or wine, for example, to people at their homes in New Hampshire. And there's also competition from other products that people might use for recreation instead of alcohol. For example, legalized recreational cannabis in neighboring states. The Liquor Commission has identified that as a source of competition for their liquor sales. At least they see it that way.
Even though I seem to recall that when there were discussions of how you legalized marijuana in New Hampshire, that looking at the Liquor Commission model in terms of how it could be, I don't recall if that was speculation or but that you could look at that as a model you would say successfully, but with revenues declining, maybe it's not a successful model. I mean,
well, it's a different product, right? So it's hard to say.
Yep.
I think that there were some proposals that would have put more recreational legalized cannabis or recreational legalized cannabis either under the Liquor Commission or something like the Liquor Commission. One of the concerns about putting it under the Liquor Commission is there was potentially a federal funds implication.
Yep.
And of course, the federal government does not see recreational marijuana as something that is legal, right? That's not legal under federal law.
Yep.
So that's one of the ways in which many states have, but New Hampshire would have to navigate how to legalize cannabis and raise money from recreational marijuana. Should it choose to do those things, that's one piece that would have to be navigated, and that might make a Liquor Commission type model a little bit trickier depending on how it's implemented.
Now, going back to lottery, just something that I think I've heard a lot of people asking, and Keno actually is something being discussed that's going to end up being a ballot question here in Concord for the local municipal elections about Keno, which currently is not in Concord, that it's a town-by-town decision. Is that revenue earmarked specifically for anything in particular? Is that state revenue generated for just the general fund, or is that a specific the lottery revenues going to a particular purpose?
Yeah, so lottery revenues have historically gone all to the Education Trust Fund to fund local public education, except for there have been some instances where, they have to pay for their operations. The Lottery Commission pays for its operations first, including winnings, which does have an expense associated with it.
Sure.
And there's also, at various points, been portions of it that are used to address problem gambling, right? A gambling addiction in the state. But most of the profits go to the Education Trust Fund to fund local public education in New Hampshire. And although the Education Trust Fund does fund some other activities, including school building aid, education freedom accounts, which may not go to local public education, but is in place of local public education for families that opt for that, and public charter schools, so not just district public schools as well. So the Lottery Commission revenues have historically all gone to education and education-related purposes. Video lottery terminals is a little different. A significant portion of those profits will go to the general fund, which is not typically how the Lottery Commission has historically funded state activities. They've usually only funded education, but the Lottery Commission's scope has been expanded in the most recent state budget, and that includes funding more general fund dollars as well.
Gotcha. Okay. Great to clear that up. Now, I'm going to hit you with a very general, broad question with a lot of the different categories we've talked about. In the research you've done, the overall kind of revenues collected versus expenditures of our state government, should New Hampshire residents and Concord residents be concerned just about the overall financial viability of our state government and about when we come up with our next biannual budget, about the next process that's going to happen? What should New Hampshire residents extrapolate from some of these findings?
Yeah, so over the last 4 state budget cycles, not counting the one that happened earlier this year, the state policymakers had the benefit of revenue surpluses, right? Revenue sources were generally doing better than they anticipated. Going into this state budget cycle, this state budget biennium that legislators were working on in the first half of this calendar year, revenues were slipping substantially. And there are a couple reasons for that. Some of them are those broader economic trends that we had talked about. Other ones are ones that state policymakers had more control over. For example, the changes to some tax revenue sources, reducing business tax rates, the elimination of the interest and dividends tax. These were all downward pressures on revenue. And if you adjust for inflation and look between what the preliminary numbers that we have for state fiscal year 2025, and the year before, it's a 9.4% drop in the general and education trust funds from state fiscal year 2024 to 2025. So what does all that mean in terms of numbers? Yeah. It means that there are fewer resources available, at least in these 2 key funds for the state budget, fewer resources available to fund services. What are some of the ways that produced trade-offs? There were lots of partially funded activities in the state budget, as opposed to relative to the levels that they were funded at prior rates. One that is specific to municipalities that was discussed but didn't end up happening was a reduction in the amount of tax revenue that's shared with municipalities as general operating support to municipalities. That was discussed and part of the House of Representatives budget proposal, but it didn't make it into the final budget proposal. But that's not something that likely would have been considered if there hadn't been this revenue constraint going into this next budget biennium. So when we look at the next 2 fiscal years, seeing how with changes in the economy, with the lack of having the interest and dividends tax, with maybe still declining business tax revenues, and with increasing, or will likely be increasing, lottery commission revenues, how does it all shake out relative to what needs to be funded? And depending, again, on all of those factors, it could be that we go into the next budget cycle with even more of a shortfall. By the way, there's also the changes the federal government is making, and some of those changes, at least in the long term, will reduce, for example, Medicaid revenue that comes into the state of New Hampshire by a pretty substantial margin. So when it comes to how the state funds these services, these revenue sources, these existing revenue sources, there's some key questions that I think the answers to those will tell us quite a bit about whether this budget will balance and what that means for the next state budget.
And we saw, a lot of these played out through New Hampshire media, and a lot of us heard with the humanities and with the State Council on the Arts, that a lot of these were discussions and debates that, a lot of hurt feelings, which I know we're talking numbers, but there's also like hurt feelings, jobs lost, a lot of impact when it came to State Council on the Arts, and when it comes to humanities and with the National Endowment matching funds and things like that. There were a lot of tough discussions that I would envision, from what I'm hearing, that we're going to have a lot more of those very difficult conversations potentially.
Yeah, and you mentioned the State Council on the Arts. I'd also point out the Office of the Child Advocate was slimmed down substantially. The Housing Appeals Board also had its funding reduced. The Prescription Drug Affordability Board was eliminated. The Department of Corrections had a little under 60 positions eliminated at it, for example. Wow. And Medicaid enrollees, or certain Medicaid enrollees who are either people with somewhat higher in the Medicaid window, but still low income, low and moderate income, and incomes that are just above the poverty level for individuals, there will be premiums that those individuals would have to pay under the state budget to help fund the Medicaid program, whereas currently they don't have to pay premiums. Now, there's some federal complications with that because the federal government, after the state budget passed, a few days later, passed a series of overhauls that will actually change that to make it a co-payment structure. So all that will shake out in some way or another, but the state has been trying to figure out spent this budget cycle trying to figure out what are ways to offset this revenue shortfall. And one of the ways is actually almost $113 million of required reductions at state agencies that aren't defined specifically by the legislature. They're called back of the budget reductions because the legislature didn't specify which budget lines in particular state agencies these reductions are coming from.
They just said you have to do it, find a way.
Yes, they said you have to do it. You have to reduce your total expenditure by this set amount. And if you add up all those amounts, that's about $113 million. And we don't know what the impacts of that are going to be on services.
But that usually ends up being personnel, right? Aren't a lot of the major expenditures your staff, your employees? There's other things too, insurance costs and supplies, but isn't it a lot of personnel expenditures by department when you look at them?
Yeah, so so personnel is a big part of what the state government spends money on. Yes, personnel and contracts that go out the door for other services, and those, the contract dollars. Again, there's some of those are already under contract, but other ones that might be changed over time. One of the ways that state agencies have historically met required reductions is by unfunding positions that are funded but vacant, right? So those positions had money behind them and they were formally state agency positions, but they hadn't been able to hire someone for it yet, or they were holding it open for whatever reason.
So it's easier to just, you're not laying someone off, you're just not backfilling the position.
Right, that's historically how it's happened. But when the governor introduced her budget proposal, many of those positions were already eliminated, right? So there wasn't very much in terms of unfunded or funded unfilled positions for the state budget to reduce. So these state agency reductions that are back of the budget reductions, some of them are likely going to have some significant impacts on what state services can be delivered. We don't know what they will be, and other than the Department of Health and Human Services, which actually has about 51 million of that 113 million total, it is the largest state agency in the state government, but it's a very significant share of that back of the budget reduction. They have a reporting requirement for what they are actually going to reduce the operations of to meet that back of the budget requirement. None of the other state agencies actually do have a reporting requirement. So I'm sure that some of it will be difficult to interpret for a good long while, because we won't exactly know what how those reductions are manifesting themselves.
Gotcha. And we, believe it or not, only have time for one or two more things. Sure. This one, again, very simplistic question, so I apologize in advance for that. The concept of reducing business taxes, especially here in the state with the way you described, it seems like in concept, the philosophy behind that is you're increasing business, you're fostering business so that business will grow and that they'll generate revenue. And does that work? Is my question. Does that, do the numbers show that actually, by cutting your business taxes, that it's going to then generate economic growth and then fill your revenues back in?
So that last part, there's not very much evidence of that at all, filling revenues back in. There are different studies that have been done in different states, across countries, as to when you lower a corporate tax rate, does that stimulate economic activity? Some studies have found no relationship. Some studies have found no clear relationship. Some studies have found a relationship, but only for short periods of time, right? There was a little bit more job growth than there might have been otherwise, but then it disappeared essentially after the first year. Some studies have found that it's only during recessions does that help. And so we at the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, we spent some time looking at this in 2023 and looked at it again in 2025, earlier this year, in a New Hampshire specific context. And there is not a correlation, not a statistical relationship between job growth and the business profits tax rate, nor is there a statistical relationship between the business profits tax rate and gross state product, right, our measure of the size of the state's economy. So because there's not that statistical relationship, it's very difficult to say whether a reduction in the business tax rates actually spurred more economic activity and more people to move across the border. Businesses also, remember, businesses are based, the amount that they owe in tax is based on the sales that are in the state. So if they are moving across the border, right, say they're moving their employment across the border, does that actually affect their tax liability in New Hampshire? It may not if the total amount of people, right, who are buying goods on one side of the border versus on the other side of the border stays the same. So we did not find a relationship between some of those key economic indicators that you would expect to see a relationship between and lower business tax rates. So as a result, it's probably about, the tax rate reduction started back in tax year 2016. Since then, for the business profits and the business enterprise tax, the state has probably foregone about $1 billion of revenue over that time period, because there's not evidence that, even though business tax revenues have gone up at least some of the time during that time, there's not evidence that it was caused by those tax rate reductions. And all states in aggregate saw, some states had some oddities going on, but in aggregate, all states saw their corporate tax revenues climb actually by a higher amount than what we saw in New Hampshire.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it at that, Phil, but this was a lot of great information. I would encourage folks to go to NHFPI.org, where all your information, it's a great website, really great information. You guys put out press releases with not just this issue brief that was just put out, but all kinds of great information. So I encourage folks to check that out. And Phil, thanks for stopping by the studio. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for asking the questions.
So this has been another episode of Community Conversations, and we thank you for watching and hope to see you on the next one.